So her last known heartbeat was 18 weeks, 2 days. We didn't know she was gone until 19 weeks, 3 or 4 days. The shock of that news is beyond words. There is nothing that can describe fully that depth and pain of that loss. And I screamed, and everybody in the whole building probably heard me because it was just so agonizing. We were expecting our third daughter. We didn't know we were having a girl yet, but we were expecting our third child. And on August 16th, we went to Shenandoah Medical Center for routine ultrasound. And the results of the ultrasound and some early testing they had done came back and said we had a 1 in 40 chance for Down syndrome. So we were told you need to go to Omaha to the Olsen Women's Center for additional testing and detailed ultrasound. So we sort of had a week to kind of, on one hand you mourn the potential that you think your child had lost, but at the same time we came to an acceptance that it didn't matter what the test said, this is still our child. So no matter what it said, we were just getting more information. And so we went with that sort of relief in mind, knowing we were just going for another ultrasound. And we had gone up there on August 24th. Because of scheduling, we couldn't go right away. And we sat through about an hour's, 40 minutes worth of genetic counseling. They went over, did your family have Down syndrome? Did we have this, have that? All sorts of things. And went and grabbed some lunch. I drank my 40 ounces of water for the ultrasound. And we get into the room. The tech introduces herself, and she turns on the machine. And my husband and I were just kind of chit-chatting back and forth a little bit. And up there, they have 2 screens. They have one on a wall that I could see and one that the tech could see, whereas most places it's just that the tech can see it. And so we weren't paying real close attention, and she started moving some things around, and then all of a sudden I noticed she was looking at my ovaries, and then the heart monitor flashed across, and then she couldn't have been doing it more than 2 minutes. She turned the machine off and said, "I'm done, I have to get the doctor." Just as the door opened, I turned to my husband and I said, "Did you see a heartbeat?" Because I had seen the fetal heart monitor flash up there, but it was up there for such a short amount of time. And they came back in, and they turned the machine back on, and Dr. Chalmers said, "I'm very sorry to tell you, but she's gone." And we went to Shan, met with the doctor, and he said, "Well, because she isn't 20 weeks, she is considered a miscarriage, not a stillbirth. So you have options. You don't have to, you're not required by law to have a final decision of the remains. You're not required to do all these things. You can, whatever you want to do, basically." Well, this is my child. This is not just some tissue. So we said, "No, we're having a funeral. First funeral is handling it. This is what we want." We delivered Melody at 12:05 a.m. on the 26th of August. And the silence of her delivery, there is no crying baby, there is no any of that. Because she was so small, she was 1 pound, 15 ounces, and 7 inches long, and she literally fit in the palm of your hand. But because she'd also been gone a week, there wasn't much they could do to stop the process of decomposition, I guess, for a better word. And they put a heating pad on her and did what they could, but they're just, so we had to let her go to Monty. They did let us know that they work with the local photographers through Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep, which takes pictures of stillborn infants, and asked if we would like them to come, and we said yes. So they put her on call so that she would be aware when we did deliver. The photographer came and took some wonderful pictures. The first pictures I have of David holding her, his eyes are so bloodshot and with the tears and everything, and I was afraid that was the only picture we would have. And we brought the girls back in. It was probably 12:30, almost 1 by the time Mom brought them over. And they're in their pajamas, and you just don't change them out of their clothes, just let them. And so we have just about 20-some pictures she took. There's a beautiful one of David holding Melody, and then there's one of him with the other 2 girls on either side of him, and just some phenomenal family pictures that we would not have otherwise had. You cannot tell me that at 20 weeks, that child magically becomes a child and not just tissue, not just whatever. You will never convince me of that. I am now 20 weeks and 3 days pregnant with our 4th child. So if something happens, God forbid, to this child, I already know he's classified as a stillbirth. But parents, to me, should not have to feel like, just because the law says this is a child, this is not a child. Well, in my mind, it's always a child. Early losses, they look at grief and have, depending on how early the loss is, if it's, if you're 7 weeks along, whatever, usually it's not necessarily identifiable as a child. It's just not, because of the way the body works. And so the grief process is often different. Some people take that very, very hard. Some people take that, they lost a child. Even though there's no viability, that is still a child. And when you're at the threshold of one definition to the other, like I said, this is still my child. As small as she was, as little as she was, this is still my child. So the fact, and I understand from a medical standpoint, from a legal standpoint, from all of this, that we have to have a definition so that we can process things, we can study things, we can categorize whatever you want to call it. I get that. But for me, she is still my child. So whether I end up with a piece of paper that says I had a child or not, I know I always had a child. And I, I've known families that I've talked to now that a lot of their losses were 30 plus weeks or 40 weeks or whatever it was. And as hard as my grief is, we were just beginning to prepare to have another child, as far as, getting another crib or getting those rooms ready, that sort of thing. I don't have an empty nursery to go home to. And like Nora with Christine with her daughter Nora, she came home to an empty nursery, an empty cradle. And it is the loss of a child is the most devastating thing any person will ever experience. There is nothing that compares to it. And unless you've experienced it, you cannot understand our grief. There is simply no way for me to explain it. You just can't. And in the waiting time to deliver Melody, I was desperately searching with my phone online to find any information about grief and what did I do to cause this or what, anything. And I found out an organization called the Myth Foundation, which is Mothers in Sympathy and Support. And it was founded by a mom who lost her daughter about 15 minutes before birth. Got her joint cacciatore, and her daughter's name was Cheyenne. And in the process of her own grief, her daughter, I think, died in 1994. And, she got things in the mail and got the death certificate, but she had no birth certificate. And she called her public health and well, you had a fetus and the fetus died. You don't get a birth certificate. How can you die if you've never been born? In our cases, it's backwards, because with stillbirth, when it happens in the womb, the death occurs before birth, but there is still a birth. We still go through labor and delivery. And I had found the information that said Iowa doesn't offer this, and it had a contact person. And the night after her funeral, that night, I had a dream about testifying before the Iowa legislature about passing what's called the Missing Angels Bill. That very next morning, I sent the contact person an email, and I said, because at the time we were told Melody was a miscarriage. So from what my understanding was, I would not get a death or a birth certificate even if I wanted one. And what I said, that I know even if the law passes in Iowa, I would not receive a birth certificate for Melody, but she will always be my child, regardless if the law classifies her as a miscarriage. But there are countless grieving Iowa families who are required to fill out a death certificate, which we initially filled out because we thought, well, if it's optional, we'll just fill it out anyway. And thus, they should receive a birth certificate acknowledging the child who was lost. The Iowa legislature needs to make this a priority for the 2012 session and not let another year pass without this law. I don't know why God took my child, but I refuse to be silent on my grief. And we ended up, I sent her that email, and I got the girls on the bus that next morning, and we ended up texting back and forth for probably 2 hours. I think I hit carpal tunnel afterwards. What I didn't know until all this was all done from a blog post that she had done, is that she had actually been trying to get this done for 11 years after the loss of her daughter. Her daughter Nora died. They had gone in for reduced movement, and they couldn't find a heartbeat. Finally, they brought in the ultrasound, and the doctor, they turned it on and said, "This is your baby, and your baby's dead." And before you can do anything else, you still have to deliver that child. And through the process of delivery, it was like a 10-hour labor, and through that process, she almost died. Was in a coma for 8 days. Her 2 living children had to say goodbye to her because they didn't know she would make it out of the coma. Luckily, they held Nora's funeral until she got out of the coma. So the first time she ever saw her daughter was at her funeral. There are no pictures of her holding her. There's none of that. The first time she ever saw her was at the service.